The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Like we did a couple of days ago, there are lots of corporate media organizations around the world that have chosen to show the Charlie Hebdo cover, the latest cover of this issue, which sold, instead of the normal 60,000 issues that they print, printing several million, and as we talked about, getting into fistfights, people in Paris to get copies of this. It does have a drawing of Mohammed, and we opted to show this. Many other corporate media outlets also opted to show this cover. We very clearly said, Louis, over the last couple of days that not showing the cover or not putting out these drawings, if we think about Charlie Hebdo, is essentially saying to terrorists that, you know, you can successfully get us not to publish what you don't want us to publish by doing these terror attacks. Absolutely the wrong message. And unfortunately, on Sky News, when interviewing someone from Charlie Hebdo, Sky News, which is part of News Corporation, the same company that owns Fox News, they panned away, they cut away when the Charlie Hebdo staffer tried to hold up the cover. Take a look at this and listen.
Much offending to kill in the name of a religion than to answer to a killing by very sweet drawings who put Mohammed outside this crime. So I'm very sad that journalists in UK do not support us, that journalists in UK betray what journalism is about by thinking that people cannot be grown enough to decide if a drawing is offending or not, because you're not even showing it. It's this, which is completely crazy, that in UK you cannot show a simple drawing as that.
So with
Mohammed
here at Sky News, we've chosen not to show that cover, so we would appreciate Caroline not showing that. I do apologise for any of our viewers who may have been offended by that. As you know, here in Sky News, we've taken the editorial decision not to feature the cover of Charlie Hebdo.
Of course, I completely disagree with this decision that they've made, Louis. To avoid offending people, they've opted not to show the cover and or drawings of Mohammed. I'm actually kind of surprised because News Corporation typically, Louis, wants to portray itself as patriotic, and they are not. They are against the terrorists, as if there are media outlets in the U.S. that are for the terrorists. They are against the terrorists, etc., and essentially doing what the terrorists want them to do. This is not only what I think of as completely the wrong decision, it's kind of surprising that Sky News, the British cousin of Fox News, is choosing to do this.
It is interesting. I assume that at some point, someone at the top told all the people at the lower levels, look, if this picture ever comes up, or if for some reason it's ever in your shot or in sight, just make sure that doesn't happen. And it's, of course, the wrong move. It's cowardly, and you're just you lose when that happens, when you're successfully censored.
I'm just trying to understand the logic, because the point of terrorism is to terrorize or scare people into doing what the terrorists want. And after this horrible attack at the Charlie Hebdo magazine and at the kosher market in France, in part over drawings of Mohammed, when a corporate media outlet says, we're not going to show that, I don't understand how it can be characterized as anything other than the terrorists getting exactly what they want. And it's just truly sad.
I think maybe some people are saying to themselves, it's just not worth it. I don't want the terrorists to win. I don't want to be censored, but it's just not worth it to me to show the image and risk and take any risks. Maybe
I wouldn't completely disagree that those are valid concerns, but when you're talking about an organization like Sky News, I would have just imagined that they were of the stature to approach it a little bit differently. Clearly, I was wrong, and that's what took place on Sky News when a Charlie Hebdo staffer tried to just hold up the cover and say, why aren't people showing this? There has been an indictment made of a man who plotted to kill John Boehner. Or did he really, in the sense that was his threat really credible? A grand jury has indicted an Ohio bartender for threatening to kill Republican House Speaker John Boehner. Michael Robert Hoyt, 44 years old, allegedly threatened to kill Boehner, who he believes is responsible for Ebola, according to a criminal complaint. John Boehner is a member of the country club where Hoyt formerly bartended. According to Boehner spokesman Michael Steele, Speaker Boehner is aware of this situation and sincerely thanks the FBI, the Capitol Police, and local authorities in Ohio for their efforts. According to the criminal complaint, which was filed in a U.S. District Court in Southern Ohio, Ohio's Deer Park police chief contacted the FBI and Capitol Police about a 911 call that 44-year-old Hoyt made in October and alleged threats made later when an officer showed up at the bartender's home address. Hoyt advised that he had been fired from his job at the Wetherington Country Club in Westchester, Ohio, and did not have time to put something in John Boehner's drink. Hoyt told the officer that he was Jesus Christ and that he was going to kill Boehner because Boehner was mean to him at the country club and because Boehner is responsible for Ebola. Hoyt told the officers he did have a Beretta 380 automatic handgun that he was going to be using to shoot Boehner. He volunteered to go into a psychiatric evaluation, and investigators later found an SKS assault rifle magazine in his home. His mother said she had taken the gun itself to her home, where authorities located the weapon. Hoyt also had a psychotic episode about 2 years ago, according to this complaint. When I saw that the guy thought Boehner was responsible for Ebola, my first question, Lewis, was what channel did he get that idea from?
It's a good question. There's a channel that frequently accused perhaps Obama of being responsible for Ebola, or at least responsible for Ebola sickness in the United States. It's interesting to me. This whole situation is just obviously mental illness here.
Of course.
But you know, he made a lot of claims, and one of them was that John Boehner was mean to him at the bar or club or whatever. And I think that one is probably true.
Well, I was more interested not so much in whether that's true or not, because again, how do we even define something so subjective as being mean? But the fact that amid so much discussion about John Boehner's potential drinking problem, that it was a bartender who regularly was dealing with Boehner, who was thinking of assassinating him, that's certainly an interesting factor. And then the other thing I was thinking of was this gentleman had guns, and we have a Congress that very recently chose not to strengthen or make more strict the background check requirements when it comes to the mentally ill population acquiring weapons. And here we have a situation where a member of Congress was potentially, right, if we believe that these threats were real and credible threats, potentially at risk as a result of a mentally ill person with a gun.
Of course. Do you think that had John Boehner been shot at or shot by this man, he might have changed his tune when it came to gun restrictions?
It's so hard to say because, we saw Gabrielle Giffords shot and still couldn't really get much done when it comes to gun safety regulation. So I don't know. But in any case, this man has been indicted. We will see ultimately what the sentence is. And John Boehner aware of it, and I guess just glad that the FBI did their job, which does not always happen when you hear an initial report of a threat. Very often, when it is not a high-profile individual, you see, or I won't say very often, I'll say too often, more often than should happen, no police action is taken, Lewis, because of questions about the credibility of that threat, and later crimes are sometimes committed.
Yeah, I guess it's just, normal for them to attach more significance, importance to someone like John Boehner.
More police shootings in Albuquerque just one day after District Attorney Carrie Bradenberg announced she's seeking murder charges against 2 officers involved in the shooting of that mentally ill homeless man, James Boyd, last year. We have yet another officer-involved shooting in Albuquerque. Tuesday also, as it stands, marked the anniversary of Ken Ellis's death at the hands of the Albuquerque Police Department, which has killed 28 people since Ellis's death 5 years ago. Last week, true to what appears to be the department's shoot first, ask questions later mentality of the last 5 years, Lieutenant Greg Brockle shot an undercover officer during a drug bust over $60 worth of meth. Albuquerque police spokeswoman Selena Espinoza stated that the fleeing man fired shots at the officers. At least one officer returned fire, killing the suspect. The department alleges that the man was wearing body armor and that his weapon was found near his body. However, there are numerous witnesses that are disputing this story. One witness named Patrick said, "If he had body armor he was holding, maybe that's the case. I never saw it. I saw his body a minute afterwards. I saw his material shirt halfway folded up his body as he was laying there like this. I did not identify any body armor on him." Patrick also said that his neighbor saw the cop fire on the suspect with civilian cars between the officer and his target. He says the officers did not even interview any of the witnesses whatsoever. And then the story gets even weirder. A chief deputy district attorney was barred from attending a briefing with the police about the shooting. And there's an arrangement in Albuquerque where the district attorneys are supposed to be allowed to attend these briefings. It is kind of part of their protocol with regard to these investigations. And the report is that this chief deputy district attorney wasn't even allowed to go to the briefing, Lewis. The bizarre details just mounting in yet another Albuquerque shooting.
I would say the details are not so bizarre. We have police protecting each other, possibly the DA protecting the police. It seems like business as usual for the Albuquerque Police Department, unfortunately.
This is a story not only about overuse of force by police in Albuquerque, but as usual, somewhere wrapped up in this, often we find the war on drugs. And remember, the context for this entire incident was a $60 meth bust. So never far behind issues of police brutality seem to be somewhere issues of the war on drugs.
Yeah, the two seem just intrinsically linked, and it's very unfortunate that the little guy is taking such a beating because of it.
A Christian pastor stopped a funeral after it had started, after finding out that the deceased was gay. The family and friends of Vanessa Collier were stunned by her sudden death. 33-year-old, died on December 30th, was married, had 2 children with her wife. The chapel where the funeral was being held was chosen because of its convenient location, which was close to where the deceased grew up in Lakewood, Colorado. But New Hope Ministries turned out to be the wrong place for this ceremony. On the day of the funeral, Collier's family and friends gathered in the New Hope Chapel, where Pastor Ray Chavez was leading the memorial, and about 15 minutes into the service, he stopped and noticed that there were pictures of the deceased with her wife and children that had been placed on the coffin, and said the pictures must go. The gathering of people was obviously shocked, then devastated, and ultimately got very, very angry. They picked up their flowers, they picked up their programs, they picked up the casket, Lewis, and marched across the street to the newcomer funeral home, which not only had no problem whatsoever with the deceased being a lesbian woman, they were accommodating and immediately put together a service for this group of people. 2 incredible stories here. One, this church, Ray Chavez, the pastor, choosing to end this ceremony after finding out that the deceased was a lesbian woman, but also the accommodating nature of the funeral home across the street with minutes notice was able to put together funeral services here. Just a both disturbing story and also a story that shows you that there actually are still nice, empathetic people out there running businesses.
One of the big questions for me is 2 questions. Why was the family here in the first place? Maybe no one knew anything about the position of this particular church or whatever.
Well, in the same way, I assume, Lewis, that in the same way that Ray Chavez did not know that the deceased was a lesbian, the family may have had equally no idea that Ray Chavez was a homophobe.
Right. But also, just knowing that that this is the position of, generally, the position of the church, I mean, shouldn't you just choose somewhere else to have your service?
Absolutely. And this is probably something that is legal in the sense that when we talk about businesses that are being run, there are certain non-discrimination rules that some states have and that really all states should have. But here we are talking about what's going on inside of the church. And I actually say, if this is their bigoted worldview and it's staying within the bounds of their church, let them do that. My concern in terms of non-discrimination laws is not so much within churches. I actually think that people should just be getting out of all of these churches that are discriminatory. But the broader issue here of religious freedom used by pseudo-Christians, when it applies within the church, okay, I wouldn't want to have my funeral, I wouldn't want to have anyone I know's funeral at a service where the church is bigoted. I don't want them to be forced, right? I would rather give my business to someone else. But when it goes beyond the church and their expression of religious freedom limits the freedom and liberty of others not to be discriminated against when it comes to businesses and public organizations, that absolutely is unacceptable. And that's really what is illuminated to me by this story.
I think, yeah, that's an important part of it. And you know what? Let's not stop at funerals. Let's stop having weddings too at these churches.
Oh, absolutely. No question about it. Well, let's take a break. Follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/dpacman. I have a great recommendation coming up for you after the break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Our program is mostly funded by our audience. Remember that we produce this podcast at no cost to the audience. We also provide it at no cost to over 180 radio and television stations. And we do rely on the support of those who do have the financial means to support us to make the program free and possible for all of the other viewers and listeners across all media platforms. You can join David Pakman Show membership at davidpakman.com/membership. And today's new member of the day, a guy who is doing a lot to help this program, is Ronald Ramsey. Ron, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. And of course, thanks for all the great stories that you send us. I have a film recommendation for you today. It's a documentary called Print the Legend. On a recent bonus show, Lewis talked about 3D printing. And this is a film that is about 3D printing, and it's about a lot of the companies involved in 3D printing, including MakerBot and Formlabs and Stratasys and 3D Systems. And that part is really interesting because it's abundantly clear that in the next 5 to 10 years, what we are able to do with 3D printers is going to grow exponentially. But the other really interesting aspect of this movie is that it follows companies that are starting very, very small. And you actually see a couple of these companies go from these small startups where decisions are made quickly and it's a small crew deciding on what to do. As the investment money comes in and businesses start to grow, you actually see in front of your eyes how companies become slower, and I want to parse my words here to not be negative when it comes to some of these companies, and less nimble with regard to decision making, and how the progress of the company can actually become removed from the original mission of the founders. And when we talk about big companies and kind of evil corporations, I've said many times, I don't think many companies are inherently evil, nor are the people within them. But very often the dynamic that develops as companies grow creates a system that leads to bad decisions for people. And on so many levels, Lewis, I can't recommend this film more highly. Print the Legend. It is a Netflix original.
I am all about the 3D printing. I talk about it frequently, and this sounds like a pretty good one. I haven't seen it, and I did not even know it existed. So thank you for the recommendation.
No, thank you for listening, Lewis. I really do appreciate it. And again, the name of the film is Print the Legend, a 2014 documentary about the 3D printing industry. I really recommend it. Send me your thoughts if you check it out. We have some really interesting tweets to compare with regard to how corporate media handles rioting by white people versus by non-white people. And Brian sent me some of this data, which we checked out, and it is very, very interesting. You may have heard that recently thousands of people flooded the streets of Columbus, Ohio, lighting close to 100 fires, vandalizing property, requiring the deployment of the riot police after the Ohio State Buckeyes won the national championship for college football. How did corporate media describe these mostly white rioters? Well, NBC News tweeted, quote, riot cops used tear gas on revelers in Columbus after Ohio State's title win. USA Today, tear gas and stare downs, how Ohio State celebrations got a little bit out of hand. Remember, 89 fires were set there 5 months earlier in Ferguson, Missouri, when police killed an unarmed teenager named Michael Brown. Residents of that city, which happens to be 67% black, went to the streets to protest, demanding accountability from a law enforcement apparatus that was disproportionately targeting minorities, as they felt. One fire was lit, burning down a convenience store, yet the media, the corporate media, unwaveringly referred to what was going on there as riots. The participants were rioters and looters, even though the looters may have actually just come from out of town and were taking the advantage of the opportunity that was presented there. And meanwhile, when you look at the commentary made by others with regard to those riots, you had former New York City police chief calling them savages. You had Ted Nugent calling them thugs. But Lewis, when it's Ohio State and it's mostly middle-class white college kids, these are just revelers, Lewis, that got a little out of hand by setting 89 times more fires than what we saw in Ferguson, Missouri.
I think that when you're reading a story about a celebration like this, people are thinking to themselves, oh, those stupid drunk kids got out of control. It's not rooted in a situation like the Michael Brown killing. So people just, they wrap their minds around it differently, because here you have something that started with a very violent act, and the follow-up immediately just has that, there's that connection. And so you just assume that it's also violent and just more dangerous somehow. Consider
another example. Remember when Joe Paterno, the head coach, former head coach of Penn State's football team, when he was fired after the Jerry Sandusky sex abuse scandal, all of a sudden, because someone lost their job for ignoring the sexual abuse of children, Penn State students started rioting. And again, given this kind of whitewash treatment by corporate media where, yeah, there were some isolated incidents, but listen, tensions were running high. They really loved their coach here, who was implicated in the cover-up of child sex abuse, systematic child sex abuse. And again, the same connotations are not used with regard to the rioters. It's a very clear double standard. Part of it, we see that there is a racial tinge to it. There is probably a class tinge to it. And as Lewis says, the catalyst probably makes a difference in terms of how it's portrayed by corporate media, although I don't think there's anything particularly innocuous about a cover-up of child sex abuse.
Not at all. I think there's something to be said about the reaction of the police department in different cases too, and what they say about the matter. I'm sure the way they would talk about the Ohio riot is different than the way they would talk about the Ferguson riot.
An anti-vaccine mom said she would rather lose her baby than vaccinate her baby. This is a Tacoma, Washington woman who says that she would rather give up the newest addition to her family than comply with a rule that mandates flu shots for all parents and children in foster homes with children younger than 2 years of age. According to KOMOnews.com, Jamie Smith, a foster mother of 7, is unwilling to expose herself or her children to flu vaccines, which she says contain mercury and could cause brain damage. She says, quote, "I've done a lot of research on it, and I don't like some of the side effects it has." Currently under her care is a 2-week-old baby boy who could be removed from the home if Smith follows through with her refusal to take the vaccine, to accept the vaccine for her older children in her home. She says she's willing to let him go back into the foster system rather than allowing the other foster kids to be exposed to the vaccine. Foster families have been given until the end of February to comply with the flu shot law. Now, of course, the study that linked vaccines with autism has been debunked. The publisher of that study has been exposed as having a financial connection to a measles-only vaccine. And we, if you're a clear-thinking individual based in science, you already know most of this stuff. What was your reaction to this, Lewis, when you saw her comments? She would rather have the child removed than have a flu vaccine.
Well, I think that clearly this is a woman of principle, for whatever that means.
Yeah.
But where does it stop? If we're just talking about a flu shot here, that's one thing. But if in the future this child comes down with a serious illness, is this going to be the type of person who will not seek the proper medical care? I think you have to consider that too.
Well, I had another thought, which is that imagine that her child was immunosuppressed or for whatever reason couldn't have the flu shot. And as a result of other parents choosing not to vaccinate their kids, they got the flu and then passed it to her child, who, because of their weakened immune system, ended up dying from the flu. Would she be angry at those other parents who opted not to vaccinate their children? These are really the questions that I wish we would see answered by some of the anti-vaxxers.
I'd really like to hear from the audience on this one. Who agrees with this? Who disagrees with this? With the flu shot?
Next, we will talk to emergency room physician John Moser. And later on in the program, instead of voicemail today, I'm going to read some of the recent hate mail that came in.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Dr. John Moser, who's an emergency room physician, CEO of Humans for a Healthier World, and also author of The Supercivilization. And Dr. Moser, in your book, you kind of talk about a way in which healthcare and climate change and terrorism and so many other issues come together, and you've talked quite a bit about the modern human as the possible catalyst for some of the problems we're seeing. Let's start there. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is that we have been confronted in the 21st century with a unique situation that we've never faced as a species. And the problems that I see as I look back over the last 12 years of research were that we have massively increased interconnectedness, increased disparities in wealth throughout the world and within this country also, and also a declining resource base. These three factors have come together, in my opinion, to make a unique situation, what I call the human predicament of the 21st century. And that human predicament is that we're faced with these three issues, and we haven't yet even addressed the fact that they exist. And that's what I decided to write the book about, is to make everyone aware that these three conditions exist, and we have therefore entered the realm of what I call the supercivilization.
Well, it's interesting because as I read your book, there were, well, without using the same language, so to speak, there were a lot of the same ideas presented as those that some futurists like Ray Kurzweil, for example, talk about, this kind of accelerating advancement of human technology. He frames it or couches it under a much more positive and optimistic sort of context, whereas you are understandably concerned about some of the impacts that could come from these advancements. But do you agree that there are some similarities, at least in terms of what you see as the changes to civilization when we look at what you say and what some of the futurists say?
Oh, absolutely. No question. And, you know, it's real problematic because I'm not necessarily saying that the future is we're not capable of dealing with the future. I think we are. In fact, I would like to be an optimist. Most people would paint me as a pessimist, but I think in order for us to resolve the challenges, we first have to acknowledge these three factors. And these three factors have come together to create many of the problems such as climate change, and that's first and foremost what I see as the most dangerous problem for humanity. We haven't even gotten to the point, really, where political leaders, well, look what happened in Brazil just last week. And in fact, Andy Revkin wrote about it in his column on .earth, where Brazil had as part of their ministry for the environment a climate denier. in this day and age, can you imagine in 2015 we have someone who's a leader in a government that does not even believe in climate change?
Well, you have to look no farther than here in the U.S. I mean, just the other day we reported that 72% of Senate Republicans fall under the umbrella of what we would consider to be climate deniers. It is incredible that some of these individuals are kind of being allowed to sit at the proverbial adult table. But when I broke down, Dr. Moser, each component part of the concerns that you have, individually, these are all addressable concerns, right? When we talk about wealth inequality, we increasingly have a good sense, particularly when you talk to skilled economists, of how the wealth inequality gap could be reduced. When you talk about the declining resource base, we know that we do have more than enough resources to properly feed everyone on this planet, but we have a sort of resource allocation issue. So do you agree that, for the most part, that the problems you point out in the book are all fixable?
Absolutely. In fact, that's right, why I wrote the book. If you look at, for example, the Millennium Development Goals set out by the United Nations, we are making progress. It's when we put our minds to resolving problems, we can solve them. And that's the whole point. And of course, that's what I call, interestingly, in the last page of the book, the paradox of the paradox, which is, even though we have so much disorder in the world, and that gets into the theory behind why I was less than sanguine about the future, is that we can take our emotions. We have so many emotions running amok because of our increased interconnectedness. But if we can take those emotions and channel them, we can come up with some really awesome stuff. So I would like to think that people would read the book and come to the conclusion that if we do the things necessary, and that includes every person, this is what I think is important, is that every person has been mandated to sign the social contract of the world. This is the first time in human history, and that's the unique aspect of the supercivilization.
Yeah, well, I know some libertarians who would not agree with you. They reject the concept of the social contract. I completely agree with you, but I think that's an area where we get to a kind of roadblock in truly adjusting the trajectory, so to speak, that there are those who, for political reasons or ideological reasons, think that we're not even having the right conversation when we think about how to work together to change the trajectory.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I call it the politician of the 20th century. A lot of people in this country still believe in the 1950s and 1960s, where the United States ruled, and what the United States did, the rest of the world will follow. And of course, you have that is not a realistic appraisal of today's modern human. And so the end result is, if we can all get a grassroots movement together, where we all say, hey, look, the leaders work for us, we don't work for our leadership, then I think we can make some really great things happen. But, you just brought it up yourself. You look at like James Inhofe, the classic example of a politician who doesn't really care whether people or not believe in climate change. He is not going to reverse his position. And no matter what you try to tell him or beat him into the head. And so what you have to do is just make sure that those politicians who are not believing in climate change, make sure that they're not elected. And
and what's
in Oklahoma,
so sad is that James Inhofe is now going to have an important position on the science committee, and he's a guy who he's on record as saying that he doesn't believe God would create a planet that humans could so easily disrupt, and you're not going to get too far with that. If you were to put in place an action plan, right, when you talk about your 10-point mission statement for humanity, if we were to translate that into action, we know that we're on the cusp of significant technological and medical and other advancements. What would you put into place a parallel to that to try to make this development be as possible for humanity as possible, as opposed to a detriment?
Well, it's interesting. Most people, when they read the book, they say, well, okay, how are you going to implement your 10-point plan? How are you going to come about? You know what? I think the first thing that I'm trying to do, because what I believe there's a paradox of individual power. That is, we all have the power. If you look at what happened in Paris, for example, and the march that just occurred, and then the countries that came together, you had despicable individuals who went into a cartoonist shop and murdered people. I believe you can use that positively. And so that's what I want to do. I want to be a positive influence. I want to say, okay, first thing, let's come to a global realization, because at the end of the book, I say the first thing we have to do is we have to realize we're a super civilization. So that's the first step that we've got to do, is we all got to realize that we're in a potential cliff here. And I don't think we've done that. That's the first thing that we've got to do. And until we do that, we're not going to resolve these major problems such as climate change and terrorism. So that's what I see as the major stumbling block to us dealing with the 21st century, is that we have leaders still living in the 20th century.
The book, again, is The Supercivilization. We've been speaking with Dr. John Moser. He's an emergency room physician, also the CEO of Humans for a Healthier World. Very, very interesting book. Thanks so much for being with us today.
I'm honored to be on your show, Mr. Pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Right-wing hero Ben Carson, who is an African-American neurosurgeon and kind of a guy that a lot of Republicans like to point to as evidence that they are not racist, in spite of the fact that many of the policies put forth by the Republican Party disproportionately negatively affect non-white individuals, has now been exposed as having shilled for a company that promoted absolute quackery, AIDS and cancer cures, and I hesitate to even use that term. Jim Garrity describes in very much detail the ties between Ben Carson and a company called Manatech, which is a medical supplement company that misleadingly markets its products to help, that it claims help people with Tay-Sachs, autism, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and ALS. And at one point, the company even boasted of a miracle cure for AIDS and cancer. And in March of last year, Dr. Ben Carson, Republican hero, conservative star, potential 2016 presidential contender, I guess potentially, appeared in a video for Manatech Incorporated. And smiling into the camera, he talked about the great benefits of glyconutrient products. He said the wonderful thing about a company like Manatech is that they recognize that when God made us, he gave us the right fuel. And that fuel was the right kind of healthy food. You know, we live in a society that is very sophisticated, and sometimes we're not able to achieve the original diet, and we have to alter our diet to fit our lifestyle. Many of the natural things are not included in our diet. Basically, what the company is doing is trying to find a way to restore natural diet as a medicine or as a mechanism for maintaining health. In 2007, 3 years after Carson first dealt with Manatech, Texas Attorney General, then Attorney General Greg Abbott, sued the company, charging them with orchestrating an unlawful marketing scheme that exaggerated the product's health benefits. It's funny, Lewis, because some people say, well, you know what? Ben Carson may be a little bit out there in terms of some of his political views, Obama being a Nazi, all that stuff. He is a great doctor, though, and we should really trust him on all things health-related. Turns out we can't actually trust him on that either, can we?
It sounds like cash is king. And this is another example of that. I never trusted this guy in the first place.
No.
With all the crazy conspiracy theories he spews, he's just a total joke. Interestingly
enough, if Ben Carson does run in 2016, he wouldn't be the only recent Republican candidate with a track record of boosting quackery medical companies. Mike Huckabee once emailed his fans a sponsored message from a company that was promising Alzheimer's and Parkinson's remedies, and another one offering a biblical cancer cure from the Bible, as biblical would suggest. So Ben Carson is in good company when it comes to this.
I think he's got a great group of friends, indeed.
Hey, the term liberal is getting more and more popular. For a while there, it was really becoming kind of an ad hominem attack on people's beliefs and worldview. But we have a new Gallup poll which suggests that not only, well, first of all, let's go piece by piece. We hear that independent is a more and more common party identification. That is not true, according to the recent Gallup poll. But more interestingly, the term liberal is getting more and more popular. The number of people who call themselves moderate is down 4 points over the last 10 years, from 38 to 34%. The number of people who call themselves conservative is down a few points, from 43% in 1992 to 40% in 2004, and all the way down to 38% now. The number of people who call themselves liberals in terms of their political ideology has been on a steady increase. In 1992, it was only 17%. In 2001, it was up to 20%. In 2008, it was up to 22%. And it is now at 24%. And with regard to liberals in various parties, so you could be a Republican and still say your ideology is liberal. There aren't that many of those people. Within the Republican Party, 5% of the Republican Party considers themselves liberals, up from 4%. If we look at independents, 21% call themselves liberals, up from 18% just 5 years ago. And when you look at Democrats, back in 2000, only 29% of Democrats called themselves liberal, and now 44% of Democrats call themselves liberal. So separate from how people vote, because we know a lot of times people will not vote their own best interests or even for the candidate that represents their specific beliefs or positions on issues, we see that the willingness to say, I am a liberal, has increased significantly over the last 15 years.
Well, I think the country is becoming more liberal. I mean, we agree with that.
Yeah.
And well, that's got to be a part of it. I mean, the ultra conservatives are not winning. The religious fanatics are not winning. And so the country's becoming more liberal and people are becoming more comfortable calling themselves liberal.
There's no question that for years we have seen that liberal principles do really well in polls that are not tinged with party bias. Now it seems lagging somewhat behind that, but it is happening. The term liberal, the ideology of liberalism, is being more embraced now that people are coming to terms with the fact that on issues, they already are liberal, and we're going to continue following these numbers for years to come. Today, instead of voicemails, I'm going to read to you some recent hate mail that I got. What these share in common is most of them have all sorts of insane grammar. The first one is from Ben. Ben wrote in and said, "You're such a little bitch." Y-O-U-R, of course. Maybe if you actually took time to educate yourself, then you would be able to understand things like normal people can, you ignorant snob. Abner wrote in saying, "Your smug, smirking a-hole persona made me decide to preemptively block you on Twitter." Thank you, Abner. I appreciate you doing that. Francisco wrote in saying, "Your rant is absurd. You do not count. Please continue, as is your right, but know that you are being laughed at by millions." Lewis, I wish we were being laughed at by millions, because that would be a sign that our audience was growing very, very quickly. I actually wish that Francisco was right here.
So better to be laughed at by millions than cheered at by thousands?
Well, you have to assume that if there are millions laughing at us, that there are probably at least several 100,000, if not millions, who appreciate the work we're doing. So I hope someday Francisco's claim is true. And lastly, Kevin, hey, David, listened to your show for the first time as I was told I should. Wow, everyone is right. You are an effing idiot. So some words of encouragement, Lewis, from Kevin.
Beautifully put. I couldn't agree more. Oh, wait, no, I disagree. Sorry.
And just for people to know, that these were all emails received in the 5 minutes before we went on the air today. No, that's an exaggeration, but they are all pretty recent. On today's bonus show, Lewis will talk to us about the flaws in sci-fi shows and whether this is something that should be pointed out. We will talk about Ohio's taxation of out-of-town athletes, and we will also talk about a unique story called the Ghost Boy story. What is that all about? Find out on the bonus show. Remember, your membership subsidizes our show for all of those who can't afford to pay for it. Go to davidpakman.com/membership to become a member today, and we will talk to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.